want to welcome you. Please silence your phones if you happen to have a phone that's on. If you don't mind taking a minute to silence it, that would be very helpful to us. And I think some of you noticed in the back of the room, they have a very nice display from the library. We want to thank the library personnel here for letting us meet here as they have in the past. And we'll continue to have our once a month Tuesday talk having to do with the Chautauqua presentations that are coming up in the summer at the festival. And also the winter one, we have one coming up very soon, the Winter Chautauqua. We've already had the presentation on that. And so anyway, there are some brochures, very brief but very succinct information here about the events this year. And all of these are free, of course. And they include the library talks here in the evening and in preparation for our festival. And it also has the dates for some of the events that are going to be taking place this summer. And I want to remind you especially of the special thing we have coming up in February on Pablo Picasso. We had the presentation on Picasso here a couple of months ago, I believe. But anyway, on February 9th and 10th, it will be in, they'll be in the Greenville area, Simpsonville on the 9th, and Wade Hampton High School on the 10th. And you're not required to register for that. We also have presentations on the summer speakers in Spartanburg. They'll be doing presentations there as well, but you have to register for the events that are tied in with Spartanburg. That's a requirement. But be sure you pick up one of these if you don't have it already. That will give you a lot of information that you need. The future talks that we'll have here over the next few months, once a month, will be on Maria Van Trapp, Cass Elliot, Stagecoach Mary Fields, who probably is a new name to many of you, and then also one that's a generic figure, El Vaquero, the cowboy in Spanish, El Vaquero. And so that will be sort of a generic thing about the cowboy, but we will have presentations about the upcoming programs over the Tuesdays. And then in the summer, that's when you really want to go to the festival in June 7th through June 16th. And they'll be here in Greenville, they'll be in Spartanburg and other places as well. So, at the end of the program tonight, we do have one request. If you're able, and don't strain yourself, if you're able to help us get the chairs out of the way as you leave, that would be very, very thoughtful of you, but some of you really shouldn't be moving things around like that, but if you can, that would be great. Okay, I'm going to introduce Larry Bounds very briefly. A lot of you know him. Some of you may have had him as a teacher at some point. He's been here for many years. He had quite a career at Wade Hampton High School. That's probably where most people know him from, except for the Chautauqua connection, of course. But he was an outstanding teacher, won all kinds of awards, board-certified national teacher, and he had a career with Ripley for a while. Some of you saw him do a presentation of Ripley very recently, one of our Chautauqua presentations. He's done other people. He's probably, I would say, the most frequent actor we've had in Chautauqua over the years. He's done Churchill, Einstein, Walter Cronkite, Walt Disney, and quite a number of other people. Not only here, but in Colorado and also in Florida. He is literally known nationally for his presentations, so we're very lucky to have him. And this is unique tonight, having him talk about the figure he's going to be presenting in June. So it won't be a duplicate of that. He's not in costume. He's not going to be acting as the person, but we will give you an opportunity at the end to ask questions of him, and there'll be two people. I and somebody else will be available for you to make sure that you have access to a microphone so that you can ask the questions you wish. So without further ado, Larry Bounds, please come forward.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. How many of you, when you went to school, for sure in high school, possibly as early as middle school, how many of you learned about Charles Dickens? See, you probably know everything I'm going to tell you tonight. Except the difference is you were in middle school or high school. And when one is informed in high school, I know from many, many years of teaching high school English, that when one is saying, I'm going to introduce you to this wonderful author and these amazing characters, the wonder and the amazement I feel is not necessarily the wonder and the amazement that is felt by the audience, who would much rather be looking it up quickly on their phone and going on to something else. But tonight we're going to explore Charles Dickens. Here he is. I'm going to scoot over a bit so everybody can see. Charles Dickens, the greatest novelist of the Victorian age. In fact, considered one of the greatest novelists in the English language. The novel is, at that time, actually a relatively recent invention. The first novels came into production in the very late 1600s and through the 1700s. But it was even then, it was a fairly new art form. But he's the master. And not only was he a master, as we will discover, of the art form of the novel, but he was a master of how to properly publicize it and write it in the way that earned him the greatest amount of money. Or as some of my students said, why does he use so many words? Was he getting paid by the word? Well, sort of. Yes, that was in part true, but really the words were necessary. Just a bit more words than we're often used to if reading something that's just come in on the internet. So let us begin by talking about those words. All right, good. By the way, I'm a great believer in simplified PowerPoints, where there's a key image and you're not reading tons of words. I have one quotation that occupies a couple of lines, but other than that, these are going to be fairly easy to spot from a distance. Do you talk like Dickens? Now, I could use the expression, what the Dickens am I saying here? But Dickens did not create the expression, what the Dickens? Does anybody know who did create the expression, what the Dickens? No? It was Shakespeare, who, just in case you weren't aware of this, did not personally know Charles Dickens. Dickens is actually a country, it's a rural English from the 1500s. It's a rural name for the devil. Just like we change certain words, and instead of saying certain curses, we changing it to gosh or gosh darn, if you want to be really crude, that takes the place of other GDs that are being implied by the use of gosh darn. Instead of actually naming the devil, you can say, what the Dickens? Dickens was the devil, and it kept you from calling up the devil. So does that mean that Charles Dickens is named? No, it doesn't. But when I say, do you talk like Dickens, Shakespeare created a lot of language, a lot of original English language. The first one to coin the term assassination. We know that word, common English, but who knew Shakespeare coined assassination? If you submerge yourself in a hot, soapy tub, you don't think about the fact that Shakespeare coined the word submerge, to go underwater. There are lists. You can go online and find a list of lots and lots of language coined by Shakespeare. But what about Charles Dickens? Did he add to the English language? Well, he did. And I think the news of this should set the audience abuzz. Okay, not exactly a buzz, but a buzz was one of his words. First opened and first shared in A Tale of Two Cities, where the courtroom was abuzz. But I've posted a few others on here. So let's take a look. From David Copperfield, have you ever had the creeps? Or had a case of the Butterfingers? Maybe you're devil may care, or you get confused and aggravated and flummox the whole thing. These are all original and I think fairly common expressions that were created originally by Charles Dickens. In the Pickwick Papers, one of his first major publications, actually his second major publication, you have whiz bang and you have sawbones. If you ever watch Gunsmoke, they always talked about Doc Adams as that old sawbones. Well, the term would have been very new for the folks living in 1870s Dodge City, because it was only created maybe 20 years before by 20 or 30 years before by Charles Dickens. And when I have the quote, there's a term up here, it says household words. That's not one of his novels. That's one of the magazines that he edited. He edited 2 magazines. One of the more prominent ones was Household Words, and he did articles. He's renowned for his 15 novels, dozens and dozens of short stories, and also his essays. He was a prolific essayist, and in Household Words, he commented on the situations of the day. And one of the things that he commented on was all the red tape that was being used in government affairs. And where did that come from? Well, apparently, when you worked in the law, you would close a file, seal a document, wrap up a scroll with a piece of red tape, and you'd have to break the tape seal to open it so that it could be kept away from. But you actually, once you got the documents ready, you would put red tape on them to seal them, this is the permanent record now. He referred to lawyers who he did not tend to treat very kindly. He referred to lawyers as red tape worms. Puts a whole different emphasis on it, doesn't it? So do you think like Dickens? Obviously, we do speak a lot like Dickens. And there, by the way, I will mention, I brought my little cheat sheet here so I wouldn't forget any of them. If you're a great author and you like to create new words, it doesn't mean that all of your new words are successful. So I do want to share 1 or 2 that perhaps some of you use this, but is there anyone here who's a Gradgrind? No Gradgrinds? Gradgrinds. Any Gradgrinds here? A Gradgrind is someone who is very cold-blooded and totally fact-based. A Gradgrind. Yeah. Or perhaps, if you're not the life of the party, but the death of the party, you would be referred to as a jog-trotty. You see, none of these are at all familiar, right? So I have a whole list of totally unfamiliar words that he also tried to invent, but just like with Shakespeare, there are terms that he used that never caught on, but quite a few that did. So, do you think like Christmas? Do you have some of the opinions that you have been given by Charles Dickens? Well, up on the board, the first is Christmas. Now, Charles Dickens was born in 1812. If you were living in Greenville, South Carolina in 1812, how did you celebrate Christmas? Anybody know? I'm not going to ask, does anybody remember? But the way that Christmas was celebrated, in a truly American tradition, because remember, when the Puritans settled in New England, they outlawed Christmas celebrations. They're not biblical. And it was against the law. You celebrate Christmas, and it's considered to be an act of impiety. So it was not a highly revered holiday. In fact, in the early 1800s, for those people, usually people from German ancestry and that celebrated Christmas, the way they celebrated it was in the early 1800s in the newspapers of Greenville. It shows that the settlers would get loaded on homemade whiskey and shoot their guns in the front yard. There you go. Yeah. Now, I'm originally from Knoxville, Tennessee, Eastern Tennessee. Farm family goes back to the days of the Revolution there. And I always heard stories of when the big public gatherings for some holiday came up, like Christmas. They would have an anvil shoot. Anybody ever attended an anvil shoot? I've actually attended an anvil shoot. It's very impressive. They take an anvil, an actual blacksmith's anvil, which is hollow in the base, and they fill the base with gunpowder, and they put the anvil down, and they light a fuse under it, and everyone stands at some distance apart, and when the fuse burns up under the anvil, it blows this large quantity of gunpowder and sends the anvil flying into the air and then tumbling back to earth. What better way to celebrate the birth of Christ than shooting your anvil? So we don't do that anymore. We don't think of Christmas as a get drunk and shoot your gun to drive off the evil spirits or whatever kind of day. And where did this come? Well, actually, the celebrations that we know of as Christmas, including the Christmas tree, all start about the same time. With Queen Victoria marrying a German noble, a man high in rank in Germany, and he brings the German traditions, which include the Yule tree and the decorations and the giving of gifts. He brings that in. The Queen Victoria publishes a postcard that has a picture of the family gathered around the tree, and that's where the idea across England of having a tree like the Queen had. And Dickens, of course, writes A Christmas Carol, which focuses the intent of Christmas on generosity, kindness, helping others. These are all ideas fostered that were not common before he did this. In fact, the whole idea of a white Christmas and his writing about white Christmas, he wrote a series of Christmas books. Once Christmas Carol was such a big hit, he came back and did The Chimes and then another Christmas book, very short, novellas. But his look at Christmas and the idea of a white Christmas as being more magical, some of that goes back to his youth, and we'll talk about his youth in just a minute. But in his youth, there was a weird weather phenomenon where as a boy growing up, when he was very young and very impressionable, they had 8 white Christmases in a row. And that like never happens in England because they have the hot weather coming up, the hot air coming up from the Gulf Stream, and it usually keeps them wet in the winter, not snowy in the winter. But he grew up as a little boy, the white Christmases. Those were the magical Christmases for him. And so that becomes part of our tradition, the white Christmas. Also, the idea that there is such a thing as an unacceptable level of poverty. I think all of us in this room know that if there's a person who's that hungry, that desperate, trying to get by, it's okay to help them. But that was not the case with him growing up. It was pretty much, you get it for yourself or you don't deserve to have it. That's not necessarily the most acceptable thought now, though I do hear people advertising it at times. The law, this is a quote from this is my largest quote with text from the whole slideshow today. This is from the Harvard Law Review, talking about the law. No 2 books outside the bounds of technical law are more worth reading for law students than the Pickwick Papers and Bleak House. And that was because, and we're going to see why in just a minute, they are filled with legal complications, legal activities, legal jargon, people being destroyed by the legal process, all to the enrichment of the lawyers who are stretching things out and making things as costly as possible. This is a problem he saw in his day, and we'll talk about that. And then medicine. Yes, Dickens had an effect on medicine. He diagnosed one of his characters as having an illness. It was in, am I going to think? Oh, in the Pickwick Papers. No? Yeah, it was in the Pickwick Papers. There was this very obese boy named Joe. He was referred to in the book as Joe the Fat Boy. And Joe the Fat Boy kept falling asleep. He just couldn't stay awake. And they assumed he was just up late eating all the time, and that's why he was. But Dickens points out this condition and treats it as a medical condition. 120 years after the Pickwick Papers are printed, in a medical review, research has been done, and it turns out, yes, the reason that Joe the Fat Boy behaved the way he did, it was a clinical description of someone suffering from what is called hypoventilation. They weren't getting enough oxygen because of their obesity. And it is a treatable condition. It is now a recognized condition since the 1950s. But he spotted it because he paid attention to people. So, who was Charles Dickens? First thing you say, he was an author, right? Anything else? Anybody want to throw something out here? Who was Charles Dickens? Author. Yes. Actor. Yes. He is an actor? Yes. Yes. a businessman, and a very good, successful businessman. Maybe the only one in his family. Well, no, wait, one of his kids was good at that too. But so all of these things are true. Let's take a look then at Dickens' childhood. Here I have an illustration of Dickens at work at the age of 12. He's the little boy hunched over with a can of shoe polish in his hands. At the age of 12, he is going to be pasting labels onto shoe polish cans in a factory in a grubby section of London, where he's going to work for more than a year, getting paid practically nothing. And from this practically nothing, he is not only paying for his own meals at the age of 12, but he is also paying for his own room and board. He is also contributing money to get his father out of prison, for debtor's prison. In fact, his whole family is going to be in debtor's prison. Now, if you were living in Dickens' time, you never heard this story. It would have been so horrible to admit that your family had fallen on such hard times. Because remember, there's no unacceptable level of poverty. If you're poor, if you're having trouble, it's your fault, and whatever happens to you, it's all on you. But he would never have advertised it. He wrote about it one time when he was about 30 years old. He began sort of an autobiography. It wasn't published, but during his lifetime, the fact that at the age of 12, he was condemned to a life of practically slave labor would not have been known. It would have been considered disgraceful. Afterwards, it was, here's a man who rose from this to that. It became a big deal, and it was talked about, but only after he had passed. So his childhood, he was born in Portsmouth, the port city of Portsmouth. His father had a very respectable job working as a clerk for the naval office. Paid sailors, wrote checks and kept books. He was a clerk. He was paid all right. He was married, and he and his wife had 10 children. Large families were not uncommon in this time period. Dickens is born, I believe he's the 7th son or the 7th child, and they have a lot of need for a lot. And the father, while he may be a clerk and an accountant and whatever, is also not practical. He spends money recklessly, and he's inclined to make up the deficit by borrowing freely. So he begins to work up debts. He works up enough debts that there are complaints made to the naval office of one of their officers not getting their debts paid. So he gets transferred to a new posting. And Dickens is only about 2 years old when they leave Portsmouth, so he doesn't have a history with Portsmouth. But then he lives at the next port, Roxbury, where he grows up. Basically, his childhood for the next 7 years is spent there. His father's condition doesn't change. He still spends too much and borrows too much and finds the need to move again. This time he gets posted to London. It's a new start, perhaps, except he brings all his bad habits with him. So when Charles Dickens is only 11 years old, they move to London. And London is, at this time, the largest city on earth. It had gone from about 1 million people at the beginning of the 1800s. By 1850, it's 2.5 million people. It's the largest city on earth. And with being the largest population of any city on earth, there's all these opportunities and all these dangers and an incredible amount of pollution of a city with no sewer systems. So how do they handle that necessary problem? They have cesspits. They basically have pits where all the waste goes to the pit, and the smells rise from the pits. All around the city, dispersed pits. Some of them not cleaned up and shoveled out for years at a time. So that even at Buckingham Palace, there's a stench that hangs over the city. But it's a city that Dickens comes to love. And after a year in London, his father has run up enough debts that the debt collectors come and they drag him off to debtor's prison. Now, even as a little boy, when I first heard this story, I thought, well, if the father owes this money, if the family owes this money, how does putting him in jail pay off his debts? Because you can't get out until you've paid off your debts. And of course, the way you do it is when you have that large a family, the kids that are old enough to work go to work. They're allowed, in fact, to live in the debtor's prison with the father, and then go out and get jobs and build up the money like Dickens is going to do at the age of 12. He's going to go and get a job in a factory putting labels on cans of shoe polish. He is even then, of course, embarrassed by this job. One of the other boys that works with him goes home with him afterwards. He's living in one of these tiny little cubby holes of a place. It's dirty. It costs practically nothing. He doesn't want his friend from work, who's probably in about as desperate a situation as he is, to know. So he goes up to a nicer location and knocks on the door to go in and say goodbye to his neighbor. And then when the person lets him in, he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong house." And as soon as the friend has left, he goes into his little burrow where he stays. He eventually finds a little place to live just a block or two from the poorhouse where he can visit his family more regularly. To him, that's a step up. But eventually, after a year, the family does manage, with everyone working extra jobs, to get paid, and they pay off his debts, and he's released. And when he comes out, the discussion is, well, Charles, he's a little boy, he's only 12. Does he go back to school? And the father was against him going back to school. He was against it because he's making money. And we can use all the money we can possibly get. Sadly, Dickens overheard his father saying this, and I don't think he ever forgave his father for putting him. Eventually, the mother overcame the objections, and they did send him to school. He scored well. He was really good in English, surprise. He was really good in math. One of his children is going to get his bachelor's degree in mathematics. And he got the school's prize for the best performance in Latin. So the 2 or 3 years that he then had in actually a school served him very, very well. And he then went out to get a job. And the job he got was as a law clerk. For 2 years, as a teenager, he is going to work in a law office, copying text, running errands, dealing with red tape. And he's going to learn the basics of law. And he hated it. In fact, now don't spread this around, but the most fun from his writings he ever seemed to have working in that law office at the age of 16 and 17 was taking cherry pits and tossing them out the window as people walked by on the street to bounce off their top hats, using the top hats for targets. And people would come up, somebody's been pelting me with pits. And they would come up to the office and they'd be outraged, and they'd go to the window where the pits came from, and there would be little Charlie Dickens. "Me, sir? No, sir. That is a horrible thing. I would never have done something like that, sir." And he always got away with it. You would have thought that he would get caught, but he had a talent. He had an actor's talent even then. He goes from that. On his own, he studies shorthand as a teenager and becomes proficient in shorthand, which lands him as a job at the Chancery Court recording judgments. He could write as quickly as the people could talk, and he became, in effect, a court reporter. And he learned, as you read his books, which are full of the practices of law, people on trial, he knows this material. If he had wanted to pursue it, he could have gone on without a whole lot more training and gotten he could have been passed by the bar eventually. But he really did not want to be passed by the bar. No, he had dreams, and his dream was to be an actor. He loved the drama of the day. If you were in a wealthy neighborhood, and England, London, England, was a patchwork. There would be these very, very wealthy neighborhoods, and just a block over, a pitiful, poor neighborhood. The West End was wealthier than the East End, but even in those combinations, you had middle-class neighborhoods up against high-class neighborhoods next to slum neighborhoods. They were mixed, and if you were going to the theater and you were in one of the high-class neighborhoods, you went to the theaters, Covent Gardens, and places where there were officially approved plays. If you were in a legitimate theater, you had to have government permission. They had to okay your script because they didn't want anything rebellious in plays. That's been outlawed since the days of Shakespeare, when he had all this stuff about not killing people and possibly overcoming the king, and they didn't want to have any of that kind of literature. So there were laws against that kind of thing. But if you were in a poorer neighborhoods, you could go to, they weren't allowed to show plays there. It's hard to believe. They could do skits. They could do what are called blackouts, where you just have, the person comes on, does a few scenes. They could have jugglers and singers. They could have dancers. They could have costume displays and acrobats. They could have those kinds of shows because, it was considered low class. He attended everything he could get to. He loved it. He decided he wanted to be an actor. He even got at Covent Gardens, which was the high spot, he got a genuine chance to audition to be an actor. Here he is, 19 years old. He's auditioning to be an actor at Covent Gardens. But he gets sick. And he has to call and cancel the audition. Well, not call, but I guess he sent a message, or he just didn't show up. But he couldn't go. But he promised himself he'd go back a year later. At the next time they were offering open auditions, and he would try to be an actor. But something happens that changes everything. This is all as part of his childhood. As he's leaving his teen years, he gets offered a job. Mr. Hogarth, at one of the newspapers, offers him a job covering stories for the paper. I mean, he can do the great shorthand, he can write, he can take notes, and he gets hired by the paper to do articles for the paper. Then he begins to contribute his own little sketches of life in London. He would see somebody on a street corner or overhear some kind of an argument between two people or some funny conversation somewhere, and he would record it and he would turn it into an amusing story, a sketch of life in the streets of London. The rich neighborhoods, the poor neighborhoods, the in-between neighborhoods. He would do these little sketches, and they would run these, and the circulation of the newspaper increased. He became Hogarth's best friend because his articles, the ones that ran his articles with these funny stories about London, were huge successes. For those of you who perhaps are familiar with Benjamin Franklin, years before, Benjamin Franklin had done exactly the same thing for his brother's newspaper. He had created the position of Silence Dogood, who wrote these funny letters to the editor about conditions in the colonies. They could be as sarcastic and as funny as possible. People loved it. They bought more papers. Dickens is doing the same thing, writing these sketches. In fact, they were so good that they decided they should illustrate some of these sketches and bind them together to do Sketches by Boz, B-O-Z. That was Dickens' nickname. Apparently from something he said as a child when he was very, very little and couldn't pronounce things, he was called Boz. Maybe one of his brothers or sister called him Boz, but he became Boz. And so this anonymous writer, Boz, becomes. In fact, he impresses his boss, Hogarth, so much that his boss, Hogarth, introduces him to his 17, 18-year-old daughter, Catherine. And 2 years later, they're married. Okay. Dickens' family. Here is a picture of Charles Dickens with his two oldest daughters, there's a bunch of them. Two oldest daughters, Mary and Kate. They were his second child and his third child, born to him and Catherine. Dickens' own family, like I said, had 10 children. They had a father that wasn't earning what he should earn, or even if he did earn what he should earn, he was spending it and borrowing more, which is a condition that would last him his entire life. Dickens would continue to sort of bail his father out as time went on. When Dickens began his own family, he had been earning money now from Sketches by Boz, and there had been an offer made. There was a comic artist who drew cartoons of middle-class and even lower-class Cockneys who got their hands on some money and thought of themselves as elites in London. And he wrote satirical cartoons showing these lower-class people acting as upper-class people. So when they went horse riding, they fell off their horses. When they did this, everything was wrong. He thought it was a really humorous thing, insult the poor and needy. So, or the upstarts, those who want to rise in society, that's not good in a class structure. He was going to draw the cartoons, and Dickens was going to write a story to go with the cartoon, and then they would publish this. This was the idea. When they contacted Dickens to do this, because Dickens had just done Sketches by Boz, which was very successful, had even been printed as a separate book of collection of his articles, they decided that they would hire him, but he was old enough now, in his middle 20s, that he said, I really don't want to make up a story based on his cartoons. I think it'd be better if I make up the story and he draws and illustrates the story that I create. And because of his success with Sketches, they agreed to that. Apparently, the fellow who was the cartoonist was not overly pleased. And I'm not saying this is the cause, but a short time after this agreement was made and they started working on their first stories and cartoons, he put a gun in his mouth and blew his brains out. He had issues. But that gave Dickens a chance to pick his own choice, Crickscale, to do the cartooning. And they worked well together. They had worked well together before with Boz, with the Sketches by Boz. And so they start doing a series of these illustrated things in the magazines about these 4 up-and-coming men who are trying to find their way through society, and they're getting into all these misadventures as they try to work their way through British society. And that becomes the Pickwick Papers. And the Pickwick Papers really catch on. Now, I'll talk more about this later, but let me mention, they didn't sell a whole lot until he published the story about the sausage, where they found a button in the sausage, and the story was about why there was a button in the sausage. Anyway, after that, everybody wanted to read the latest Pickwick paper. Because of the success of the Pickwick Papers, he is able to actually lease a home, a very nice, it looks like a 3-story building. Actually, it had an attic, which was a 4th story for the servants to stay in. And it had a full basement, which made it a 5-story townhome in a nicer section. It wasn't the best section of London, but it was a nice section of London. And he and his family, which is now several children, move in there. And he begins his career. He writes Oliver Twist. He writes Nicholas Nickleby. The money starts pouring in. That's the beginning of his great success. And his family continues to grow. He ends up having 10 children. There's his second child, it's not his second child, doesn't get counted because his wife had a miscarriage. But what would have been the second child was miscarried. But then they had 9 more children after that, for a total of 10 children. And of those, which is a very good record for the Victorian age, 9 of the 10 children actually survived to adulthood. Some don't survive much past adulthood, but only one of them dies in infancy, which was very unusual for the Victorian period. Partly due to the fact that there were giant cesspits. Anyway, it's called cholera. Multiple ravagings of cholera through the millions of people who lived in London. So he starts. This illustration is a collection of characters from the Pickwick Papers. The The Pickwick pages, the Pickwick, it is delightful. It is charming. It is funny. He's not insulting these people and making fun of these people. He's putting these people in comic situations and seeing how they get out or don't get out of it. There's Joe, the fat boy. It's down there. And Pickwick, he's the guy over with the big smile over on the right-hand side. These become very, very successful, as I said. They get republished. Everybody's looking for each new episode to come out, and that's his start. And he continues on from there. His popularity grows, and as he continues his career, he is going to find that one of the best ways in the world for him to make money is to stand in the spotlight. See, I'll take the spotlight. And we had a special custom-made stand in red velvet and wood, and he would stand there with his arm propped up on a little velvet-covered wooden block, and he would read his novels or select portions of his novels to the audience. Now, that may not sound exciting, but he packed the house because he didn't just read the novel. He read the novel. And then she turned, well, I may be just a scrawny, poor old woman, but I am an English woman, and you're not getting past me. Oh, you are this animal, this pig. I will pass you. I will go through that door. Oh, I'll fight ya. He animated it. He talked them up. He did this show. As you can see from these illustrations, cartoons over the next 10, he did almost nothing but full-time readings for the last 10 years of his life. But these pictures, you see him standing, the posing, the acting. Remember, in the theater, especially in the poorer theaters where they weren't allowed to do whole plays, they could still do melodramas. You guys know the traditional format for a melodrama, right? I'll act out a melodrama for you. Are you ready? The curtain rises. Oh, I can't pay the rent. But you must pay the rent. But I can't pay the rent. But you must pay the rent. I'll pay the rent. My hero. Curses. Foiled again. Yeah. Classic melodrama. Thank you. He did that. The writings, in fact, a few of his books have not received the long-term attention that perhaps they deserve because people say, oh, it's just too melodramatic. That's what he wanted. He wanted to stir the emotion, to make it as big as possible. And when he read, he went out there. In his later years, he will have a doctor off stage. And at the intermission between the readings, he'll step off and have pulses taken. He was beginning to have heart issues. He would have medicines given to help calm down the heartbeats and all that. He got into this. This was a big deal. And his popularity soared. One of the things he's going to do that I'm not going to talk about tonight, but one of the things he's going to do is to go to America. And the reason I'm not talking about his trips to America is that when we have Charles Dickens on stage in June here for the Chautauqua Festival, the topic is image or truth. How much of the image is truth? How much truth is there in the image? And Dickens had this view of America, what he thought America, a classless society, a society where all men are created equal, where they have rights by birth. You know, he wanted to come here and see how they fixed all the problems that he saw in the streets of London. And so he came to America with his wife and a companion for her, and they sailed to America, and he toured everywhere. South, the far west, you name it, he went everywhere, welcomed everywhere, did readings. And then before the Civil War, and then he came back years later after the Civil War. And he wrote books, a book of his travels in America. One of his novels is in the back there, Martin Chuzzlewit. He included American scenes where he did for America what he did for England. Equally, fairly, unabashedly told the truth. You can imagine how well that went over with his American audience. But we'll talk about that in the what he said and what he saw, the good, the bad, and the indifferent that he reported on. But I'm going to save that for the June festival. And here, let me talk about the fact that he was still very popular. In fact, when they shipped over books, like the book with Little Nell, the Old Curiosity Shop with Little Nell. Anybody read the Old Curiosity Shop? You don't know about that? Okay, one of the great classic, really it's one of the ones that people don't read because it's too melodramatic. But it was so, and it came out, he printed, and this is his secret of printing, is that he would print it in monthly installments, 2 chapters a month would be printed in a magazine, a monthly magazine. And it would take a year and a half for all the episodes to come together. And so you'd read the 2 chapters, and then you'd talk it over with your friends, and they'd go out for 1 shilling, and they'd buy the magazine and get the 2 chapters. And everybody was, whoa, what's going to happen next? Because he would leave each 2 chapters with a cliffhanger. When I had my students read, for example, The Tale of Two Cities, they would have a reading assignment of 2 chapters. And then they'd come in going, what's going to happen next? Because that's the whole point, right? You do 2 chapters at a time. They're not all that long, and you can just go through the whole book pretty quickly. But when the shipment of books for the Old Curiosity Shop arrive in port in America, there are thousands of people who have heard the shipment is due with the next sequel to the Old Curiosity Shop. And people stood on the banks in New York, and the ship came in, and they shouted, "Is Nell dead?" Because when they left her, she was like on her deathbed. But is she dead yet? Is Nell dead? Did they save Nell? This was the big thing. And they brought the ship. Now, he had a problem with America, and I will mention this, is that America did not recognize British copyrights. And because they did not recognize British copyrights, as soon as his books came and sold, printers would grab copies of his books, and then they would just set up their type and they'd run off their own copies. And so he wasn't making really any, other than the initial shipment that got there, he didn't make any money on any of the books sold in America. And he was just as popular in America as he was in England. So one of the reasons he came to America was to talk the American Congress into letting British copyrights be as good in America, and that American copyright should be good in England. And he really pushed for that. It didn't work. So hugely successful, huge crowds, lots of money, all successful. I've already talked about start. I must have pushed the wrong button. Dickens Family. I'm going backwards. Oh, I'm pushing the wrong button. Sorry. I was 1 space over. Dickens Family, Dickens Start, Dickens Popularity. So why, after all these years, is he considered the greatest of the British Victorian novelists? And some would claim the greatest of all novelists. Part of it has to do with his subject matter. Mostly it had to do with his characters. Shakespeare, if you say Romeo and Juliet, everyone knows what you're talking about. You're talking about, love that just is going to fail, love that is doomed. Everybody knows Romeo and Juliet. They're all going to drink poison and die. Or get killed by a sword. So Hamlet, you have certain characters that you just mentioned. King Lear. I'm of an age where I'm beginning to really appreciate what King Lear went through. And you just say the name and you know the whole. Well, we have the same thing with Dickens, just like with Shakespeare. If somebody's a Scrooge, you don't have to explain it. Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, these fellows that tried so hard, overcame adversity of birth, these are all characters that we relate to, we recognize. Even poor little Nell. How sad. Where he ever got the idea for poor little Nell, this teenage girl, so good, so kind. Well, if we go back to his family, when his wife started having children, and she's going to have 10 children over the next 15 years of their marriage, when she starts having the first couple of babies, her younger sister, Mary, comes to live with them and help take care of the children, especially when there are several children. And Mary becomes ill and dies literally in Charles Dickens. He's nursing her, he's helping her. She dies in his arms. This beautiful 18-year-old girl dies in his arms, and it just really tears him up. There are those who wonder, did he have an affair with Mary? And those who say, no, he didn't have an affair with Mary, but he did fall in love with her because she would be the one girl in his life that never grew old, never changed, never was anything other than this helpful, sweet, beautiful girl. All the other women in his life did this horrible thing to him. They grew older. The first time that he fell in love with this very beautiful, flirtatious young lady, and she turned him down because her father was a banker. She had much better opportunities than a fellow who wasn't even a successful writer yet. But he always thought that even though he was happily married to Catherine, and they had all these children, though after 4 children, he decided enough with the children. And then they had number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, and number 10. And by that time, he was just really over the whole thing. He actually divided up their bedrooms, separate beds, all that. Got to find some way to cut off the kid supply. But there was this dream girl. And when he becomes super successful, the dream girl writes him a letter. She had married somebody else. But she writes him a letter and says, you know, I've been reading your books. You're so famous. May I come and visit? So here's the girl he should have married instead of the woman who's, you know, she sort of lost her figure after 10 kids and you know, she lost a baby and she's shown signs of postpartum depression with some of the pregnancies. I mean, that's a real downer for this guy. And so here's this girl from his youth who is coming back into his life, and he's so excited, and he gets all dressed up, and she comes, and she's 40 years old and fat. And he's crushed because he was expecting the teenage girl that he fell in love with and was turned away by. But that's not who he gets. So in his next novel, he creates a character just like the girl he dated, and she shows up later, and she's overweight, and she's vapid, and it makes a great comic character. Hopefully, she did not recognize herself in this character because it would be most insulting. But so that happens. By the way, when Sister Mary dies, the youngest sister, because his wife's family had 10 children, and the youngest sister, Georgina, she moves in and helps out, and she's going to be there with the kids for years to come. As a matter of fact, she'll be there after he divorces Catherine, and he gets possession of all the kids because it's Victorian England and he's the moneymaker. He finds a home for her. He puts aside money for Catherine, and off she goes. Their oldest son, Charles Dickens Jr., is almost 20, and he goes with her to help take care of the mom. But the other children are not allowed to see mom. He's going on to other things. We'll get to that. That's not why he's the greatest. He's the greatest because of his characters and how alive they became and how they inspired people to be better and how they inspired other authors. Tolstoy listed Dickens as one of the greatest influences on his writing. Dostoevsky did the same. Faulkner said that he learned from Dickens how to write a novel. Orwell, George Orwell, he interpreted as best he could, because Orwell was something of a really dedicated socialist. And he really wanted to claim that Dickens was a socialist, and he studied his writings. And there are socialistic tendencies because in Americans, or in European society, there's sort of a balance between capitalism and socialism. You have social services, but you also have individual businesses and all that. But he said that he finally gave up on trying to declare that Dickens was a socialist because it turns out that what Dickens simply wanted was for people to behave better. He wanted people to be kind and generous and thoughtful of one another. And that's what he was trying to get. He wasn't trying to emphasize, let's change this law and let's change that law. He was trying to emphasize, let's change people and get them aware of how they can be better people. And everybody benefits when we're all better people. Instead of going to the lowest denominator, go to the highest. But these are all things that were advocated, things that other writers picked up on, and that is why his stories are still amazing today, even whether you're looking at original copies of his text, his 15 novels. By the way, I told you they were printed serially in magazines, and then you could buy the bound sets in what were called three-deckers. A three-decker is the first third of, if you read, for example, The Tale of Two Cities, it's divided into three parts. Part 1, chapters 1 through 1. Part 2, chapters 1 through part 3. That's because it was, when it was finally bound, it was bound as a three-decker, 3 separate books. You could buy the book with the first third, the book with the next third, the book with the final third. And then they would reprint again. You see, making money every time you sell the book, you make multiple books. You buy the magazines, you make money. You buy the three-decker, you make money. You then have the nice leather-bound editions, you make more money. See, he's a businessman. And of course, all of his books have been made into movies. Even in the silent era, as soon as they could start doing movies, they were doing Dickens movies, those in Westerns. They all were very popular. So for all these reasons, as a matter of fact, I came across one critic of, a critic meaning an analyst of someone who analyzes, not someone who's critical of. But one fella said that when you read some of Dickens' novels, the fact that he's telling 2 stories side by side simultaneously is just like what later 20th century filmmakers began to do, where they would put 2 scenes happening at the same time on the screen side by side, so you could see how this character's doing it and how it parallels with what that character's doing, and you could sort of see him that way. He said Dickens was doing that in print 75 years before. So very creative, very original, very successful. So, as we come towards the question and answer period, Dickens' final years. Well, I've already mentioned he divorces his wife. He finally has sort of had enough. This is a middle-age crisis. They've been married for 22 years, so he's in his mid-40s. Perfect time for a middle-age crisis. Plus, he's got all these other interests now. He is supporting, though nobody knows about it, it's one of his secret charities, he supports a home for prostitutes to take them off the streets, teach them usable skills. He refuses to allow ministers to lecture them. You said, no, they need to learn how to do this kind of a job or that kind of a job so they can make a living outside of the brothels. They don't need to have somebody preach at them. So he's credited with, he and the woman that he had running the place for him are credited with at least turning around and saving the lives of over 100 women, taking them from lives on the street, which was very dangerous, not just for physical abuse, but the Victorian period, the #1 disease of the Victorian period was syphilis. I mean, among all classes of people. But some 100 women were saved by going through his program. He supported charities and social action like that. One of the things he also supported was theater. He turned some of his writings into plays, or he created separate plays, just as theater pieces. And he and his family, with his children, they would act them out. That was something the family did for recreation, would act out their own plays. But then some of the plays were taken by professional actors, and they were done in legitimate theater. And he supported a theater company that was producing plays, and people would turn out to see the plays of Charles Dickens. And one of the people who turned out for the play to be an actress in the play was this 18-year-old girl named Ellen Ternan. Ellen Ternan. She's beautiful. He's 43. She's 18. He becomes enchanted with her, and a year later, he's divorced, which is accomplished by some really complicated legal twists. His knowledge of the law served him well when it came to getting rid of his wife and sort of putting her off limits to the entire family. But he supplies Ellen, whom he calls Nellie, he supplies Nellie with her own place to live, and he supports her. And he moves her to a new location that's more accessible by the train, at only 12 minutes from his house to her house by way of a regularly running train there in London. And they have a relationship for the last 12 years, though there is great controversy over whether it was a sexual relationship or not. Because in a modern day, we would say, well, of course it was. But no, it very likely was not. He was having that perfect, beautiful young girl, like his former sister-in-law who died, maybe, like the girl he wished he had dated in his youth had been when he saw her later. This is sort of complicated. We do know from Ellen's own mouth, years later, 40 years later, when she is a respectable married woman married to a minister, dressed with the high collars and all the Victorian gear. The only quote we have from her about her relationship with Dickens, that he took care of her for 12 years, visited often, though no one knew about it, everybody did. She said, "I abhorred the old man's touch." Yeah. I think he would have appreciated the ooh. Yeah, that was, so what was their relationship? Ooh. Anyway, so Dickens' very final years. In 1865, he's in a train crash. This illustration is from a newspaper which shows Dickens when the train jumps the track. He was returning from Paris, where he's been doing readings and selling books. Here is another newspaper picture of the train wreck. He's coming back from Paris. He's in England, and the train crash is dreadful. Many, many deaths. He is saved by the fact that his car didn't crash off the bridge to the ground below, but was one of the ones left dangling. And so he climbed out of the train car, made his way. He was, of course, even then he was shaken up and thrown around the inside of the car. But considering the horrible damage done to others, he went about, he used his hat to collect fresh water to give people. He bandaged wounds. He stayed there until emergency crews could arrive. And here is, the most successful writer in all of England. Here is this man who's a literary legend, and he is saved in the train wreck, and he provides aid. He becomes a hero. Though in some ways he never recovers from this. After his second trip to America, which was practically all book tours, readings, when he came back to England, his beard was more gray than brown. His hair was getting definitely more and more white. They say in the 6 months or so he was away, he aged many years. Just from all the shows he did, all the work he did, all the things he did. And so from the time of the train wreck to the time of his death, he continued to do the shows, but under a doctor's watch. He had, of course, gone from one home to another home, each one bigger and better. I have to share this story. One of my favorite Dickens stories when he's a little boy in that second home that he and his family lived in as a little boy. I think it was Roxbury, but he's on a walk with his dad. Dickens loved to walk. His whole life, if he was stuck for a storyline or something, stuck for what's going to happen next, he would simply put on something warm and go for a walk. And he could walk 20 miles through the streets of London. He loved London. London was his inspiration. When he moves later to the country, he finds himself suffering from writer's block because he can't walk the streets of London. So he'll go back to London and walk the streets to clear the writer's block. But he's out for a walk as a boy with his dad. And they pass by this house called Gad's Hill. And it's an old house. It's been there for 300 years. It's a house that actually plays a role. In one of Shakespeare's plays, there's a burglary that happens at Gad's Hill, or Gad's Hall. And his father points out this lovely, big house and says, now remember, son, if you work really hard, someday you can live in a house like that. And with that in mind, when eventually he does become wealthy enough, he goes back to that country home and he purchases this house, Gad's Hall. When you see the final picture of him, in fact, I'll go ahead and show you. Here we go. Oh, no, that's not the final picture. That's his dead picture. But when you see the final picture for the question and answers, which we're almost to, he's sitting in the room at Gad's Hall where he did his final writings. But by that time, he owned several houses. Anyway, for 5 years after the train wreck, his health has continued to go bad. He moves on. And on the 5th anniversary of the train wreck, on the day of the 5th anniversary of the train wreck, he is writing his first mystery novel. He's changing his genres. He's writing a novel called The Mystery of Edwin Drood. And he's doing 2 chapters at a time, and he's up to the halfway point. He finishes the page on the midway chapter, and he collapses out of his chair onto the floor. He's had a stroke, a cerebral hemorrhage. They take him to his room. They call in the doctors. What can they do? 1870, they're not doing open brain surgery, right? They're not putting him in a CT scanner and identifying the problem and going in with probes. They're putting him in his bed to see if he gets better. He dies before the night's over. So it's a fairly quick and, I suppose, painless death. But he just collapses and dies. He's 58 years old. When the news comes out that Dickens has died at 58, this is another newspaper clipping illustration, which shows him with the laurel wreaths around him, with his birth date, February of 1812, his death date of June the 9th, 1870, at the age of 58. And notice that the people are weeping into their handkerchiefs. Their gentlemen have their hats on their chest. The whole country mourns. There's a story of one little girl who, when she hears Dickens has died, she says, Dickens is dead? Does that mean Father Christmas has died also? That's how closely he was associated with all of that. Anyway, that's the life and death of Dickens. His family goes on. He's got, 10 children. One of the 10 children died in infancy at the age of only 8 months. But the rest survived, at least into their early 20s. And his longest-lived child was the only child who went to a university and got a university degree. He got a bachelor's degree in mathematics and then got his master's degree in the law and became a barrister, which meant he tried cases in the Inn of Courts. And so he lived until 1933. And his first son, Charles Dickens Jr., who lived into 1913, I believe, he had 7 children. And his son, Henry Fielding Dickens, he named a lot of his children after famous authors. He also named them after his accountant and other people that he knew that he wanted to honor. But and he was going to name one after the famous writer named Oliver. Oliver, is it Hardy? Oliver, Oliver Hardy's a comedian. There was an Oliver somebody. He was going to name his son after that particular writer, but then he decided he couldn't because if he named him after that, everybody would be saying, "Oh, you're Oliver Dickens. May I have another?" He would get stuck, so instead he named him Henry Fielding. And Henry Fielding became a lawyer. He became very successful. He also had 7 children, and he lived in 1933. So the longest lived of all of Dickens' children. In fact, Henry Fielding's great-great-grandson still travels the world presenting Dickens' readings. And he carries with him Dickens' original text, where he not only underlined the lines he was going to be reading, but he put stage notes in the side telling him how his voice should change or what expression he should take. So he's able to, this great-great-great-grandson of Dickens, he's been to Anderson. I saw a listing several years ago. He was appearing at a church in Anderson. So the fellow travels around and they still. Many of the children, his oldest daughter Mary, wrote 2 books about life with her father. And in one of those books, one of the really interesting things, and something that in this picture is missing, because that's a classic picture of him in his study at Gad's Hill. That picture is missing something. Over there by the windows, there should be a mirror. When he had his writing, and across the street from there, he built a tree house with a little writing place, a little writing studio up in the tree house. And the tree house was filled with mirrors. Why mirrors? Because as he wrote, he would turn. His daughter writes about this. She'd be sitting in the living room and he'd be writing at his desk or something. And he would turn towards the mirror and begin to make these extraordinary faces and begin to gesture. "Yes, but you will come to me." And he would act these things out. And he'd try it, and then he'd try something else in this mirror, and then he'd take the one he thought, and then he'd write that one down. But he acted out the books as he wrote them to make them come alive. He wanted to get the expression. What is the face looking like when he says these lines? And he did them all in character. He did these, he's heavy on accents. When you have Jerry Cruncher in A Tale of Two Cities talking about, "Oh, you stop praying against me. Oh, you got to stop praying. You don't be down there doing that against me. You don't pray against your own husband." He would write it the way it sounded when old Jerry Cruncher, who worked in a bank as an odd job man during the day, and at night he stole dead bodies from a cemetery. So always interesting characters. Anyway, it is now time. We've taken him from his birth to his death, a couple of scandals in between. Are there questions that we could like to hear from the audience?
Just a second before we, is this on? Is it on? Okay. Yeah, before we start, a couple of things I didn't mention. I think most of you, when you walked in, saw the display of books there. I said we wanted to thank the library, but you're free to check out the books. Don't walk off with them. You're free to check out the books and materials over there if you wish. Another thing, we do always need volunteers in the summer and all the time during the year working with Chautauqua. If you want to volunteer in some way, we have a place where you can sign up to volunteer, and also make sure that if you do not get mailings and things from us, you can write on that. So we have 2 microphones here, one on each side of the room. So if you have a question, we will be glad to come up to you and let you ask the question. Please speak into the microphone as best you can, and make sure that we can understand the question.
Okay, I'll try and make sure and hold the mic close enough.
Perfect.
All right.
Sounds good.
Did Dickens have any religious affiliations? You spoke of him saying no preachers with the girls.
It wasn't because he was opposed to religion. It was opposed, these women had been preached at a lot. And he just didn't figure that these women on the streetwalkers that he was trying to save, they would have immediately negatively responded. And he appreciated it, and the woman who ran the center appreciated the fact they'd been hearing this on the streets from street evangelists probably their entire time walking the streets, and they just didn't need to hear that again. That would just be the same old thing. He wanted to offer them an option. But as far as his own religious conviction, he wrote a lot. That was it. There, I've covered his religious convictions. No, he was, I mean, a lot of the biographers say that he was obsessed. He was a compulsive worker. He worked, 7 days a week, late into the night, during the day. When he wasn't working, he was walking the streets. Now, I'll tell you what he did to learn about London is he had an Inspector Field with Scotland Yard would take him on tours of the seediest, most disreputable parts of London that would be totally unsafe for anyone who looked like they had a pound in their pocket to go to. And he would visit them all. And he became very well known in all these criminal haunts. And when he wrote characters based on Inspector Field, they were always brilliant policemen. He was very friendly with policemen. And they were happy to help him out. And then they could point to his book and say, that fellow right there, that's me. That's the good policeman here, that's me. As bad as he was to lawyers, he was very friendly with policemen. But no, religious just wasn't part of what he did. Yeah.
I just wondered if you saw this program and would you recommend it? We watched a movie called The Man Who Invented Christmas, the story of Charles Dickens.
And it's very accurate. It's not perfectly accurate, but it's very accurate. It's a fairly recent, it's just in the last year or so, I believe, it came out. The Man Who Invented Christmas. Well, it's that thing I talked about early on about inventing Christmas. And it is actually, is that like a Netflix thing or a?
It's either Netflix or Prime. That's the only two we have.
Okay, so one of those, Netflix or Prime. But it's the story of Dickens and how his father's trying to hit him up for money and how he's got bills coming in and there are still more kids and he wants to write a short book that can be a big seller quickly. And it actually, when he publishes and one thing he did that was a mistake in business, he made the book too pretty. The cover, leather, gold filigree or whatever, he wanted it to be as decorative as a Christmas wrapped gift. And so he made very little money on it. But they sold the first 6,000 copies in just a few weeks. And so they started doing reprints. And if you have enough reprints, you're going to make money. And they did. And of course, that becomes the book that probably more than any other he is known for today. Is A Christmas Carol. But yes, that movie, and it talks about the issues he's going on in his family. It talks about the parents. It talks about the writing of the book, and he's coming for ideas, and things from his past are influencing his writing of the book itself. Which brings us to our prize. We have a lottery today. Not a lottery. We have the Friends of the Library have donated a book to one lucky audience participant who is the first to answer this question about Charles Dickens. Okay, so raise your hand if you know the answer, and we will call on whichever you guys look, so I'm sure I don't call on the wrong person. Which of Dickens' books was the most autobiographical? May have to come up with another question. No, I see a tentative hand. Your hand got as far as your chin. Nicholas Nickleby is not it. But we've eliminated one of the 15. Anybody want to give another try? Not Oliver Twist. Though there are some elements from the workhouse in Oliver Twist, but it's not the one who's the most autobiographical. Yes. And we have a winner. So, if you have not read David Copperfield, or if you read it a long time ago, though I don't remember ever having that read in high school, but if you have not read David Copperfield, as you read David Copperfield, the story of this young man who rises from modest beginnings to achieve some form of success, who loses the girl that is his ideal mate, and she turns him away, and oh, wait a minute, it starts to sound familiar. David Copperfield, and the way that David Copperfield thinks and the way David Copperfield feels is a good clue as to Dickens at the same time. Yeah, so there you go. Okay. All right. Other questions? We have a few minutes before they're going to tell us to pack up and go away because they're going to close the library in about 38 minutes, if I'm reading the clock correctly. Any other questions about Dickens? What the Dickens? But now you know.
Larry,
Thank you,
was,
Larry. I'll look-
was he seems like he was the rock star of his era. He made the
Definitely.
first Christmas album, supposedly.
Yes, that was his, and he not only did that one, he did another one called The Chimes. He has several, I think he had 3 different novellas that were Christmas-based, that sort of frame a lot of the practices that we have in Christmas today. Everybody thinks, well, we've been celebrating Christmas forever, but really, Christmas, like I said, the Puritans outlawed it. It was starting to catch on in the Puritan days, and they said, no, 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 the Bible doesn't say anything about December 25th. But anyway, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I interrupted your question. Any other questions? I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I know the weather has been iffy all day, so I appreciate your courage in facing the storm possibility. We have, of course, several more people to introduce you to, all of whom in their own particular ways are quite amazing. So be sure to come to the other library performances. And then in June, well, I forget June, for now, February, Pablo Picasso is coming. And a wild and crazy guy. It'll be a great show. So be sure to come out and bring your artistic questions. There you go. Thank you all so much.